5.
Hello, good afternoon and good morning, and welcome to Deloitte's third of our 4 live webcast sessions, where we are unveiling our tech trends for 2021. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte and have a distinct pleasure to lead our CIO and tech leadership program in Canada. And this morning or afternoon, as the case might be, I am thrilled to be joined by 3 of my illustrious colleagues who are going to be sharing their thoughts, their insights on what was so far the most exciting session for me. I have the greatest anticipation about this particular one because we are going to be touching some really, really cool topics around artificial intelligence, machine learning, cybersecurity. So without much further ado, while we give people a chance to sort of dial into the session, I'm going to very briefly just introduce our speakers, but I'm also going to let everyone know that this session, like other sessions, is intended to be 1 hour long. For the first 45, 50 minutes, we are going to be sharing our insights. And then for the last 10 to 15 minutes, the audience is going to be able to ask questions, and I'll be happy sort of to moderate those questions to our panel. In light of the series, this session is, as I mentioned, session number 3 of 4. So next week, next Wednesday, at the same time and same place, we are going to be concluding this series with our final 3 trends that talk about digital and physical interaction and what we believe is going to be very relevant and at scale on that front. So now, very briefly introducing this panel that we have gathered this morning. I'm thrilled to be joined by Scott Buchholz. Scott is the Deloitte Chief Technology Officer and the lead author of our tech trends, of this material that we are sharing. And Scott is going to be enlightening us on the topic of zero trust. A distinct pleasure, and yes, Scott is joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. Distinct pleasure to have Paul Phillips joining us from San Francisco. Paul is the Managing Director and Chief Technology Officer of Deloitte Hux, which is based out of US. And Paul is going to talk on the topics of machine learning ops and the cute title of Feeding the Machine. So I look very much forward to that. And also joining us from Toronto is our managing partner of Deloitte's AI practice, Omnia practice, Jazz. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And I think that we are with that ready to rock and roll. So Scott, I think it's you first. So over to you.
Thanks, Dalibor. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I hope that your weather is warmer than it was a couple of weeks ago when we were talking to Dalibor and it was 43 below outside his house. But you know, we've talked to you a couple of times now about tech trends. I'll just remind you, we've been at this for 12 years. We try to look globally and across industries for trends that are nascent today in enterprise technology that are likely to be at scale in 18 to 24 months. We have a robust and rigorous process that we go through to filter ideas and figure out what these topics really are. And we look forward to continuing to share them with you today. If you're curious, you should and want to learn more, please feel free to go online and download the report. As I tell people, it's a svelte 166 pages, but it's easy to navigate and there's a ton of details if you want to learn more about any of the things you hear about today. All right, this is a view of our 12 years of research. I think in addition to the fact that there's a lot here And certainly there are trends from previous years, whether they're ethical technology and trust, or no ops in a serverless world, or others that you might find of interest in previous years. All of this is publicly available on our website. The one thing I would call your attention to is the row across the top is our macro forces. For those who are curious, that's our taxonomy of emerging technology change. And that's really how we guide investments internally. It's how we think about what's over the horizon for emerging technology. And it's how we help all of you, when you are talking with us, try to think about whether or not you're investing in the right places, whether you're combining things in the right ways, and just making sure that you're moving forward in these exciting areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my dear, I'm going to tell you briefly about some of the trends we're talking about. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the heart of the enterprise trends. I believe that you can go and download that recording if you're curious. Today, we're talking about all of the trends around data. Paul is here as a deep expert with years of experience doing really fabulous at-scale machine learning. So really excited to hear what he has to say. And Jazz is going to come with some of the things you're up to in Canada. So I think that's an awesome combination. And then next week, my colleague Mike Bechtel will be joining you to give you a mind-blowing session in terms of how physical and digital is coming together in new and exciting ways as we move forward. So with that, over to my friend Paul. Paul, why don't you tell everybody about MLOps?
Thank you very much, Scott. So yeah, real pleasure to be speaking today as well. And as Scott said, I'm sitting here in San Francisco. So two themes I want to talk about today. One is ML Ops, which is the industrializing AI processes in enterprises. And the second one is we call feeding the machine, but it's really about feature stores and making the creation of data structures that are native to machine learning, another important part of this automation journey that enterprises are going through. So I'm going to talk about each of those two things, probably for 5 or 6 minutes each, and then hopefully I will crystallize what they really mean in terms of an architecture by taking an example architecture, which is one I work with often, which is actually customer experience, and just show what we're seeing in the marketplace and how these two trends are really driving a significant change in how those architectures look. So first thing on ML Ops, what's that about? I think the first observation is that the way that machine learning activities are operating in most large enterprises today, they are operating on top of legacy infrastructure that doesn't really, or it wasn't really conceived to support those machine learning processes as a primary objective. And as a result of that, those machine learning operations or activities are quite encumbered in a number of ways. And typically, if we look at the way that these data science teams are working, very often they're operating in their own pods. They will find that the data hasn't been organized or structured for their own activities. And therefore, they're doing a lot of their own custom connection work. They are doing a lot of data wrangling and feature transformations, which is just being used within their pod. They're using in a development environment, which is different from the production environment, which means that when they finally build something of interest that they believe has commercial value to the enterprise, the activity of pushing that decision pipeline or machine learning pipeline into production is then a cumbersome, disjointed process, which typically has a lot of data engineering effort. And when it's finally delivered there, again, it's very hard to control robustness, etc. So if you just want to go to the next slide there, Dalibor. So 3 beats I want to touch on here with MLOps. And the first one is, the software development lifecycle process has evolved hugely over the last 20 years. It's now well rehearsed, it's efficient, using Agile and Scrum and having shared code repositories in Git, allowing other team members to pull that, do code reviews, having development environments that are identical to the production environment, having continuous integration and deployment processes which are coupling dev and production with high efficiency. So code that's developed can be pushed directly into production. The reality of most machine learning activities in large enterprises today is they do not conform to that model, that modern software development model. And so ML ops frameworks are about enabling machine learning applications to be firstly accepted that they are in fact software products, and as software products, they should be managed in the same way as we would for any other modern software application. And so ML ops really is the framework by which we can apply DevOps principles, and it's a very significant trend we're seeing in the market, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. The second trend then, or beat that comes out of this ML ops capability is once the code is being treated and version controlled, and it's available then in a Git repository and available to other teams, now you have these version controlled assets that are relatively easy for other teams to access, repurpose, update, and use for themselves. And so a simple example might be, in the case of customer experience management, once one has built a pipeline, a predictive pipeline predicting, let's say, product interest in a particular category for a consumer in, let's say, the next week, it's relatively easy to take that same decision pipeline and just update it by changing the definition of the training record set so that it's now pointing at a different product category. That pipeline now is going to be able to score consumers or consumer contexts with the probability that they'd be interested in a certain product or different product category. So we've repurposed an existing pipeline with very high efficiency. That repurposing and reuse of code and the governance that goes with it are obviously significant accelerators, both in robustness and delivery efficiency. The last beat here is really, as we move, or as we see enterprises moving their operational IP effectively from the minds of humans towards effectively the minds of machines, along with that grows the need for increased governance and transparency. One of the other nice aspects then of the ML ops frameworks is, because this is now being treated as a productized pipeline, the ability to drop into that pipeline components that will support rigorous governance processes is relatively easy. So as an example, if we have a pipeline that's being called to update a model, to include in that pipeline something that is going to retain the query that's used to generate the training record set, retain the training record set itself, to extract feature importance from the model, to retain all of the validation metrics that were resulted from that model build, and even to monitor bias against protected characteristics of a consumer, for example. It's relatively easy to build those blocks into that pipeline. And now effectively, not only do we have a nice pipeline that is governed by the software development principles that one might want, but you now have generated automatically as the course of those activities, the outputs that we need to control governance to. Dalibor, if you just go to the next one, thank you. So I will look a bit more at ML ops in a second once we cover this, the data revolution feeding the machine, and I'll put them hopefully in context that will crystallize some of this. Second significant theme then we've called, feeding the machine. This is really a combination of two things. It's really an extension of the same software development lifecycle principles actually upstream now to the data conditioning that one is using for machine learning applications. And the second theme is, it's a realization that as we do start depending more on machines for decisioning, then it makes absolute sense that we should consider them as a primary user or consumer of data for decisioning. And therefore, it makes sense that there should also exist data structures that are native and most efficient for consumption by those types of process. Just want to go to the next slide, Dalibor, thanks. So again, 3 beats here worth touching on. And the first one is, so this is about feature stores and feature management, which again, it's about efficiency and it's about automation. This is the overarching theme here. But the first beat is, if we look at the way that data is typically structured in enterprises, not surprisingly, most of it that's structured for decision support is structured for human decision support. 99% of the operational IP of most large enterprises today still resides in the minds of humans. And therefore, not surprisingly, that most of the data structuring for decision support has been around humans. The big issue is the way that humans want to consume that information for decision support, so a business analyst, versus the way a machine might want to access that data are very different. And just to call out some differences there, humans typically, we don't want to see more than 2 to 5 dimensions on a single either table or visual representation. We just find it very hard to disambiguate underlying trends when there are that many dimensions on the chart. Second thing is we tend to want to look at aggregated data forms because we want to improve the signal to noise ratio and basically dampen it down by taking that noise out and understanding the underlying features. And the third thing is just because of human cognitive bandwidth, we don't have loads of hours every day to look at management reports and slice and dice and all of those things, which typically means from a business analyst perspective, it's okay to update that data once a day. In the case of machines, we know they are enormous, objective, can handle many thousands of dimensions at the same time in a decision. And I personally used over 1 million factors, just characterizing the relationship between a consumer and a brand in a particular context in an RTB or real-time bidding context for ad placement. So machines can take huge numbers of features. Very often we're asking the machines to make micro decisions at individual level. And therefore we want to have, and often at very low latency. So this creates a requirement where we need to be able to get the raw data, transform it into very large set of features, whatever we think might be discriminatory or predictive, and get it to that machine decision process with very low latency. Clearly very different from what we were asking for human decision support. So this is where the feature management comes in. It is a capability that is allowing us to perform these transformations with very high efficiency. Second aspect here is discovery and access to different data sources. One of the things about machines is because they can, of course, use such large numbers of features, we often don't know which features are going to be more predictive or less predictive until we actually get them in the machine. So an ability to more easily connect to some data structures or data types that will not be in the warehouse and readily available, we need to have a mechanism that makes that easier. And in particular, things like streaming data sets that are coming in from web and app, for example, and feature stores help us do that. The last aspect to feature stores that I think is important to bring up is again, this is allowing us to apply rigorous software development lifecycle principles now upstream to the data transformations that are being used to feed the machine. And so now we can build in robustness into those data pipes as well. And along with that goes our ability to collaborate. So now anytime a data science team or a data engineering team is transforming raw data into a feature, that feature itself becomes part of a version control collection of features that is also available to not only other data science teams across the organization, but it's basically all of that invested effort basically now can be leveraged across the entire user base inside the enterprise. Okay, so enormous efficiency gains. Last point I'd make on that collaboration is it also allows us to have a data environment for dev, which is exactly the same as the data environment for production. And we'll see later the importance of that, but it facilitates again the pushing of developed pipelines from development to production. Dalibor, thank you. So again, just to summarize, I think, and hopefully this visual helps. What we were saying here is that the processes of software development lifecycle management have evolved hugely over the last 20 years. In the case of apps, very well rehearsed, very mature. We have dev environments that are the same as production environments. We have nice pipelines that connect the two so we can promote things to production very efficiently. Up until recently, that hasn't existed for machine learning pipelines. So clearly there was a big opportunity to do something there. Now we have tech that helps us do that. We'll talk about what they are in a second. Exactly the same applies to features. all of those upstream pipes that are going to convert raw data into formats and feature sets that are native for machine learning can also be version controlled. And even better, they can be coupled directly to the model pipeline processes such that we have a version controlled whole process. So the whole thing is much more tougher and more robust. Thanks, Edible. So there are technologies that now fit in these boxes. AWS SageMaker is a good example of an MLOps pipeline tool set. If you're more ambitious and you want to build your own, you can use Kubeflow on top of Kubernetes and do some data engineering. The fact is there are some pretty good tools out there already. So we won't talk a lot about them here, but there are quite a few. In the case of feature management and feature stores, probably slightly less mature is the reality. But if you want to learn more about it, go to featurestore.org. And you'll see that quite a large number of the kind of digital first hyperscalers are representing what they've done with feature stores. And I think there's some interesting stories there. Thank you, Daniel. So last thing I want to do to hopefully just crystallize some of the things that I've mentioned here is I'm going to use an example architecture from a customer experience, looking at how is it operating today in many large enterprises which are not using feature management and ML ops. And I just want to look at the big kind of 5 blocks here I've got. So the first one is the data inputs on the left-hand side, anything and everything that we believe will help us characterize the relationship between a consumer and a brand. We want to take it in on the left-hand side. It could be things that people have bought. It could be interactions they've had on the web or the app, or it could be third-party data that tells us the brand market share in a particular DMA, for example. We want to bring that together around consumers. So we want to have some kind of ID resolution capability that allows us to defragment those views, connect those events around individual customers, and so we have the highest fidelity customer journeys we can. The next big block there, insight and decisioning, 2 flavors going on. Typically, one is human decision support, which is that top block, well rehearsed, very mature, traditional BI, if you like, with slice and dice management reporting or whatever else. And then the bottom part there is, what's going on with machine learning today, typically. And in there, what we see is pods of data scientists kind of operating independently. They're offline, typically. They won't be able to get all the data that they need typically from the warehouse because they may need to go to other sources to get it. They do their own transformations, an iterative process in its own right, building those models. When they've actually built a model that they believe is of commercial interest, the effort then to promote it to production, the fortunate aspect is that production environment is different from the dev environment, both in terms of tool set and in terms of the access to data, which makes that a very cumbersome, risky activity. And typically today, when we speak to enterprises, they'll tell us, on average, it takes about 3 months to build a new model and promote it to production. Some enterprises will admit it's closer to a year. And if we just go to the next one, Dalibor. How does it look now after feature management and ML ops? What we see now is very cleaned up on that insight and decisioning space. There are 2 very different paths here by which data is going through and being conditioned and supporting decision-making activities. The top one as before, but the bottom one now, feature management is in place, allowing now every investment in a feature transformation. Firstly, it's version controlled. Secondly, it's available both to dev and production. And thirdly, it's available to every data science team that may be acting in that enterprise, provided, of course, that it's been rolled out appropriately. Now we have that feature management in place and you have ML ops. You now have an identical tool set and data environment, both for the development of machine learning pipelines and for the production. And I think you can see that hugely facilitates automation and the delivery of updates, model updates between dev and production. And you can completely automate, of course, the updating of models just by executing a query to generate the new training record set against that feature store. That can then be used on a scheduled basis to update models, which can then be automatically promoted to production. So huge savings in efficiency. And hopefully, you had a reasonable view here of what these 2 technologies are, but they're being adopted widely and quite aggressively now. ML ops more than probably feature stores at this point, but hopefully that was useful. Probably pass to Jazz at this point and see if there are any comments maybe about the Canadian market.
Certainly. Thanks, Paul. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here to share some thoughts with you when it comes to the application and the adoption of some of these trends in the Canadian market. We do an annual survey where we get perspectives from large organizations across Canada to understand where are we right now in terms of the maturity of AI techniques and technologies and new disciplines like MLOps that are coming up in terms of their adoption. And interestingly enough, in the last 2 years, the maturity level when it comes to Canadian organizations has increased significantly, even though I think there's still a lot more adoption that can happen. The latest stats that we've seen is there are about 33% of the organizations in Canada that would be considered as seasoned adopters. Now, this number was it was 15% 2 years ago when we did the survey. So clearly the rate in which it's going up is positive. Now, what we've also observed is as a result of the pandemic, the focus for many organizations in terms of fueling their digital transformation programs has gone up. And in any digital transformation program, AI and a data component is key in terms of helping realize those objectives that the particular transformation is embarking on, which is why we're also seeing now in the last 8 to 12 months, the pace in which the adoption for things like MLOps is further accelerating, which is positive in terms of how organizations now can help create differentiation using these disciplines. And the common theme that I'm seeing across most of our clients where they are considered, the seasoned adopters, if you will, MLOps is core, considering as Paul really well described, when you do institute that discipline within your organization, your ability to be able to create models and deploy them, your speed increases significantly, and the robustness of your models also goes up because of the discipline that's applied to the process. And most of these organizations, as if you see a pattern, they've all adopted some of the building blocks leading up to the stage that they're in right now. In that culturally, they've gone through a transformation to go about bringing agility into the organization. They've brought in practices around DevOps, and which makes the journey to actually incorporating MLOps a lot smoother. So that's also some of those underpinnings that we're seeing in most organizations that are doing it successfully. They're going from a traditional model where it was a use case by use case approach of infusing AI into solutions, if you will, to a more a broader view where AI COEs are being created with the right tools, technologies, and techniques to be able to bring that the pace and the robustness in terms of how these models are being built by having the right guardrails in place. So it's not like these COEs are being prescriptive and literally developing all the models for large enterprises. They are bringing accelerators, they're bringing certain reusable assets to the mix and providing frameworks to be able to keep the development efforts on track to minimize risk and increase the speed in which things are happening. So hence, like overall, the outcome becomes more around, the democratization of these AI models across different lines of businesses. And the last thing I'll say on MLOps is, to the point of AI being viewed as a black box, what we're seeing is there are frameworks that are being introduced around things like trustworthy AI that are being utilized as these models are being built via guidance coming from these COEs. Now, this area is still not at a stage where we are able to, where many organizations are using automation to infuse them in the development and deployment process by using techniques like hard debiasing and whatnot. But in many organizations, the frameworks are there for them to be able to reference, to apply the thinking that needs to be done to make sure that things like biases and explainability are taken into account as models are being built and validated. So we're still a bit, a few steps away from that fully automated model, but it is heading in that direction. Now, on the second trend that Paul spoke about, which is feeding the machine, from what I'm seeing in Canada is like one of the most important things that organizations are anchoring on is this notion of data mastery. And what that essentially means is everyone is looking at their foundation of how data is being managed, created, consumed, and disposed within an organization with a much tighter lens, considering now the value that the understanding of the value of data is going up, considering when you look at some of the models that are being built, and now that most of the hyperscalers are even making available pre-trained models to be used in an open source type of environment, the ways in which organizations are looking to differentiate is with what fuels these models, which is the data. So the better, higher quality your data is, the easier you're able to assemble and curate the data sets that are relevant for certain models, the better your predictions will be in terms of the models that are actually being built. So the way in which that whole management process is happening across the life cycle is getting a lot of attention. A lot of investment is going in with the organizations that would be in that seasoned adopter bucket to be able to make a difference by having those strong data foundations in place. What we're observing is organizations are not looking at it from a siloed lens of data and going deep within certain data sets in terms of the richness that they can have. They're looking at it more from a broader lens of having diverse data sets, so more variety, considering when it comes to model development, it is when you start to bring in data sets from orthogonal sources and then look for insights, the richness of your prediction goes up. So we're seeing that different types of data stores, as Paul was describing, are coming into the fold with feature stores and cloud-based warehouses to be able to allow for that variety of data sets to be able to assemble so that organizations can capitalize on it more effectively. The other observation that we're seeing is organizations are building partnerships. In some cases, there are bilateral partnerships where they're sharing data sets to be able to organize, manage them, and then be able to provide associated insights, which individually they would not be able to. And this is resulting in some cases, bilateral partnerships, in some cases, consortiums of organizations from different industries coming together, and also the notion of data trusts. That is all being incorporated now as the organization and the focus of data in order to fuel the machine is going up. Lastly, I'll just end by saying that the trend, in terms of the anticipated growth of this entire space of how the cloud computing world and the cloud data providers are coming into the foray. Stats Canada has forecasted that the spend in this particular area between 2019 and 2023 is going to be doubling. So clearly, the signals are there in terms of organizations wanting to do more in this space, and our trends essentially are an indicator of that. So with that, Dalibor, hopefully that gives a perspective. I'm going to pass it back to you for the rest.
Thank you very much. So it certainly feels that what really we are saying here is that we are all living through this phase of adolescence of AI and ML, and where we're applying these treatments of software development lifecycle and DevOps to really sort of move it from the artisanal art and magic into something that is truly industrialized and can be applied at scale. So these are really, really fantastic times to be observing these trends and be involved with them. Thank you very much, Paul and Jazz. We're going to also cover the third of the three trends that we are covering today, the one on zero trust. And for that, I will ask Scott to walk us through that final trend. Scott,
absolutely. Thanks, Dalibor. And before I start, actually, let me remind all of you that for those who are curious, you can actually read more about client stories in the report. So Loblaw was actually one of our featured clients this year as we were looking at these topics around machine ML ops and machine data revolution. So for those who are curious, I'd encourage you to check that out as well. Okay, so last topic today, zero trust. What does this mean? Well, it's interesting. This is really arguably the way we should have been doing cybersecurity for the past 50 years. And if you think back, part of, I think, where the challenge comes from is 30 or 40 years ago, we could actually conflate physical security of our networks with virtual security. In order to get on a corporate network, you actually had to walk into a building, plug a wire into a wall, and connect that to the desktop that you were lugging around with you. And in those environments, it was actually really easy to control who was on the network and who wasn't. And this comfort and idea that we've taken from physical places of perimeter security was the way that we sort of translated into this virtual world we were living in. What then happened over time is we realized, oh, people need to be able to work from remote locations because they're on the road or because they're working from home. Oh, we have cloud providers who are doing things. Oh, we'd like to have remote management of our HVAC systems or our other systems. And so what wound up happening over the course of time was this very clear notion of a castle and a moat, of a secure perimeter, became increasingly degraded over time. And where we find ourselves today is there's nowhere safe in the enterprise. There's no safe place on any of our enterprise networks. And so people are rethinking, what does this mean? How do we actually do security? How should we think about this? And I would argue the leading way that people have thought about this is this idea of zero trust. Assume every device, computer, network, system, database, what have you, is publicly available on the internet. And if it's publicly available on the internet, how would you go about securing it? What would you do differently? You would start by telling everybody, go away, right? And then you would selectively enable things from there. And that's really the spirit of zero trust. So maybe if we can go to the next slide, Dalibor. And so in order to actually go on the zero trust journey, what we found is a lot of clients have started by saying, let's pick a system, not the most critical one, because doing that one and screwing that one up would be a really big deal, and not the easiest one because we won't necessarily learn anything important, but let's pick something that's kind of in the middle. Let's rethink how we actually go about securing that piece of infrastructure, hardware, security, system, et cetera, and learn the lessons from actually doing that. Because by doing that, we're actually rethinking the basics. We probably already have the tools we need today. It's probably the case today that way too many people can get access to the application. It's probably the case today that the people who have access to the application can do way more things than their job function or their level of authorization should enable them to do. Let's go rethink how it is that we go about doing that. Let's sort of restart from there. And as we go forward and do new things, let's apply all of these principles at the outset. Let's put the requirements in so that we are designing the system appropriately, so that we're engineering things that are secure. Let's go about going on this journey early and often. Then let's make sure we're automating things. Cybersecurity happens in a flash, and we really need to have things that are automated in terms of recognition and response, but also security and access provisioning and management. And so what people are finding is they go on this journey and they're saying, let's figure out how to use the tools we have better, because almost everybody has the tools they need today. It's just reconfiguring how we're using them. We're going to use more automation. We're going to use more engineering. We're going to spend less time trying to reactively search for things that have happened, and we're going to spend more time trying to engineer security in, trying to engineer automation in a way that will respond quickly to events and incidents, and basically turn the pivot so that we go less from policy and compliance and trying to test things in at the end when we think about cybersecurity, to actually starting with things that are intrinsically secure and building on that. And then the last part of this is really, if you think about the things I just talked about, in many cases, that means people need to rethink the organization we have. We probably need to upskill the people we have in our cybersecurity organization in a number of cases to become more like cyber engineers. We need to rethink what does it mean to have these zero trust journeys and other things. And you know, sometimes people, and I might be guilty of this, think more security probably means more inconvenience. I often find that that's true when something new is installed on my laptop. The irony that we're actually finding with some of this is that it is not necessarily the case that more security and moving to zero trust means more inconvenience. In fact, it's sometimes been the exact opposite. We were talking with the CISO of Halliburton, and one of the things she was saying is, in essence, as they were able to secure things, as they were able to make things secure enough that they would be comfortable to put them on the internet, they realized that some of their corporate systems could and should be available on the internet, that you didn't actually need to go through the VPN to do everything for your job, that there were things where they were comfortable enough with the security level and the information that was there to let people do their day jobs without having to go through a VPN. And then there were other things that were more important and more sensitive. We talked at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and you know, they actually have a huge number of people, stakeholders throughout the world. They're a pharmaceutical company, they make drugs, and they want to be able to have safe, secure interactions with everybody from their patients to the physicians and clinicians who are doing trials, to their partners and distributors, to internal employees, and they want to be able, in some cases, to collaborate across all of those groups. That means that they can't afford to secure your endpoint, and therefore their journey to zero trust is thinking a lot about how do you make those things accessible. And so there are a lot of different things that people have done and ways that people have gone on this journey that have made things not just more secure, but in some cases more accessible and easier to use. And I would encourage all of you to give some thought to this, because if you think about it, whether it was some of the recent things with SolarWinds or some of the historical break-ins that we've seen, in many cases, we've had third-party systems that had more access to our network than they arguably should have in order to do the jobs they needed to do. And that's been the entry point for bad actors to actually get in and expand throughout our networks. And so zero trust is our opportunity to rethink a lot of what's going on. And that's sort of the zero trust story. Jazz, Dalibor, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I could perhaps add a perspective from what I'm seeing in Canada. This whole notion around zero trust, as you know, Scott, you really well articulated, it's kind of moving us from this concept of having security in place to security based on a persona. And when it comes to personas, the more context we can get around the user in terms of where they are, the device they're using, the type of work that they're trying to do, the task that they're trying to do, all those data points become critical to be able to decipher what the intent is and hence apply the right security controls associated with it. So what we are seeing organizations are, they're trying to implement solutions to be able to get as much of that context possible. And this ties in with the other trends nicely, because what's needed for that is data. You need data to be able to understand that context of the user in a more effective manner. And then you can actually go and start to either use commercial packages that are available to be able to, you know, use the data and apply algorithms to be able to detect threats and predict threats in some cases. But what we're also seeing a lot that's happening is organizations are choosing to leverage their investments that are happening in the data space to be able to create some of these models themselves, right? It gives, in terms of the requirements that some organizations have and the precision with which they want to understand the context of the users, some of the commercial packages are not there yet. So instead of going down that path, they're choosing to actually use the investments in their data infrastructure, in the modernized data infrastructure, which is cloud enabled, to be able to get all these data sources in, be able to build the threat models, and then use an ML ops type of approach to be able to continuously improve them, because the speed in which the threats and the security attacks are going up is a lot faster than where some of the, let's say, commercial packages are providing. So that's something else we're seeing as a trend with some of the bigger organizations. And for the most part, it is something which we see continue for the next little while around the cat and mouse game, if you will, in terms of how fast organizations need to prevent for these unanticipated attacks, and yet have the defense mechanisms in place to be able to combat them. So that's what I'll share from a Canadian perspective, Dalibor, and I'll send it back to you.
Thank you. And what is really interesting, a big takeaway for me, which I actually personally experience every day, is this conundrum or contradiction that with this increased security comes less convenience. It actually is the opposite. And I think that we can all sympathize with that, reflecting on how it was when we were VPNing into our Outlook mailbox versus today, where we are able to actually access it natively but through the internet safely. And also the multi-factor authentication that we are all, I think, enjoying now as we do our mobile banking on the phone with single-use passcodes and things like that, would be another sort of evidence of this trend in action. Now, we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if anyone in the audience would like to sort of ask any questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A feature of this Zoom platform to send your questions. I'll start with a few that have come. Can you comment on the adoption of ML ops across different industries? Do you see any particular industries that are really sort of taking advantage and leaping forward? And what might be those that are laggards in this sense? So maybe Paul, I don't know if it's for you or for Jazz or for both.
Certainly happy to comment. So some of the faster adopters are, not surprisingly, some of those kind of digital first hyperscalers. So the Ubers of this world and the Airbnbs and so on are obviously rapid adopters, and they're up there looking at feature stores and have pretty sophisticated stacks already. Another group I see are the kind of Intuits and the Apples and the kind of tech savvy technology industries. Not surprisingly, they have people who are excited by technology, and so I definitely see some of those as well, pushing quite hard on some of these trends. Little bit in the media space, beginning to see as well, the kind of Netflixes and the Comcasts and whatever. And I think the other kind of big groups are just, if you look at the largest users of SaaS, statistical software packages, and those that are spending very high license fees in that direction, not surprisingly, are also looking quite hard at some of these new trends here as approaches to improve efficiency. And so, if you just go through the industries and you look at what are the biggest consumers today of that type of technology, not surprisingly, they are also looking, fairly aggressively at, how do you perhaps use some of these new techniques. But open to other thoughts there. What, Jazz or Scott, what you're seeing?
Certainly, I can share some perspectives from my view. I would say, generally speaking, what we see is, in Canada at least, it's our banking and insurance clients who are relatively more mature in this space in terms of adoption. Having said that, what we're seeing is organizations that are prioritizing innovation and prioritizing emerging technologies as a part of their growth agenda. They are creating unique ways to be able to create capabilities in this space. In many cases, there are organizations that are creating challenger divisions or challenger business units, where they are starting with a bit of a greenfield approach and bringing in the modern techniques to be able to start off with a bit of a leapfrog approach when it comes to building some of these solutions. We're seeing this happening with the banks. We're seeing this happening in some consumer organizations. And based on what the pandemic has done, as we all know, there are certain subsectors that have been that have gotten disproportionate growth because of it, while certain sectors have lagged because of the macro trends that have impacted us. So it's these the organizations and the sectors like in retail and the grocery business where they have the growth has fueled. We are seeing there as well in terms of the pace in which organizations are maturing this area accelerate, right? Because of their needs and how they're accelerating the path in terms of their digital transformation programs and agendas.
Yeah, and we are certainly very proud that this year Loblaws, which is a Canadian company, has been featured in the actual global tech trends. Scott, I know you mentioned that very sort of loosely as we spoke. Would you be able to sort of provide some backstory to that and tease out some of the pertinent points of what we have observed and learned from Loblaws?
Sure, I can try. Hopefully I do it justice. I think if you look at the question and you look a little bit across industries, what we see is industries where competition is fierce tend to be the ones that are moving in this direction at speed. Clearly, organizations that are in industries that are being dramatically impacted by the digital natives, so hospitality, retail, and a number of others are the ones that are really the most focused on trying to figure out innovation, machine learning, AI, data, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's why, Jazz, you said the banks and Paul was talking about the technology companies. It was actually really interesting talking with Loblaws because part of what they were saying is, look, we're on a journey to we're a 100-year-old organization. We have a long, proud history of being a successful retailer. And what we're on the journey to try to do is figure out how to be a successful digital native, or how to move more and look more, feel more, and act more like a digital native. And if you look at a lot of cases, the biggest difference between the companies that have been successful to date and the digital natives, it's really around the use of data, how people think about data, how people capture data, the structure of data, the management of data. It's really the biggest difference that the digital natives have figured out is we have all this information. How do we turn it into action? How do we turn it into insight? How do we use those things to start repeatedly improving what we're doing and changing how we're operating? And Loblaws, I would say, is on the journey to start trying to do those things, to learn the lessons, to use the optimizations. They're also, interestingly, in many different areas and industries. So they, if I understood it correctly, operate everywhere from healthcare, where they have very important sensitive information, to groceries and other things, where arguably the number of tomatoes sold is not necessarily as sensitive. And what they're trying to do, in addition to figuring out not just how do we use this stuff to be thoughtfully, responsibly more effective and efficient, but also how do we do that in ways that protects the privacy of individuals in Canada, that respects the data rights and other things. And so they actually have a fascinating series of challenges in front of them that they are getting organized to tackle in a very thoughtful and deliberate way.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would like to do, if we are now a couple of minutes before the end of the session, I would just like to offer to the panel any sort of closing thoughts. I'm personally, as many of you can see, a very proud Canadian, and I am a firm believer that we have an opportunity of a century to lead globally as a country in both innovation, invention, and deployment of AI/ML opportunities, especially in the domains of trust and ethics, which I believe we have the platform to lead the world. I know that, Jazz, on that front, we are working hard and close with both academic institutions and startups across the country, but also large organizations that are actually solving those problems. I would like to, on that note, just provide a quick pitch to the Deloitte's AI Institute that you have chartered and that you are leading, Jazz. So as we are sort of approaching the closing of this session, I want to give you a mic to just provide a little bit of a overview of what that AI Institute is and invite our audience members, if they're interested, to sign up for that. And then we'll leave it to Paul and Scott to sort of provide their closing remarks. Would that be okay?
Certainly, happy to do that, Dalibor. So folks, hopefully, many of you were able to attend the launch of our institute last week. It was really, we were overwhelmed with the attendance, to be frank, and humbled. Our goal with the AI Institute is to bring the community together, where we have researchers, where we have leaders in the industry, where we have ecosystem collaborators and partners from the startup and scale-up world, all come together in a forum to talk about the most important topics in the realm of AI. We started last week with having Professor Jeffrey Hinton, who I'm sure many of you know as one of our globally leading researchers, to talk about image recognition, and we spoke about organizations that are using it in ways to be able to create a difference. So to me, I feel the situation that we are in right now with the pandemic, and as we are figuring out how we navigate out of it, I do feel it's a big opportunity that if we look at it from that lens, organizations are at a point where the motivation level of embarking on digital transformation programs to be able to create that resilience is at an all-time high. It would be a great time for organizations to look at these types of trends that we're talking about, to be able to have that leapfrogging effect. If you haven't done much in this area, jump on and capitalize on some of the leading solutions and tools and techniques and technologies to be able to make a difference for your respective organizations. And for the organizations that have been crawling in this space, now is the time to supercharge and then take your next big step forward so that you can create competitive differentiation in your organization as well. So that's what I would say, Dalibor. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Paul, any closing remarks?
Yeah, really very echoing what Jazz is saying. I think it's a unique moment in history. These are really transformational capabilities. And what I see is, some large enterprises just not knowing where to start. What I would say is you don't have to have the whole solution up front, but definitely start. Just make the decision to start. You only need to do it across, one subset, one team, one particular type of decision pipeline, but it's worthwhile getting to know the technology early. So I think that would be my comment.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Scott?
So I'll maybe try to help wrap this up by saying, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Yeah. Jazz and Paul are saying start. Human beings tend to conflate computers with calculators. We tend to assume that we need perfection from everything they do and that their answers always need to be 100% right. And what I've learned in working with Paul over the past while is oftentimes the right answer is as good as your best employee, or sometimes good enough is just having an answer that's timely. And if you think about that, that might mean that you need to do far less in terms of data and prep and a whole lot of other things than you think. And you may actually, that sort of inspiration of don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, sometimes all you need is your best human friend turned into a machine. That might help people get started because I think it makes the bar a lot less intimidating.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Scott, for that. And now, as I close this session, I would like to thank everybody for your attendance and thank our panelists. Please remember to join us next week for our closing session that will be delivered by My friend and colleague who has the coolest title of them all, the Chief Futurist at Deloitte, Mike Bechtel, who will be joining us from Chicago to talk to the final 3 trends. Well, we will be exploring the digital workplace trend, the trend around bespoke for billions, and lastly, something very, very relevant and a hot topic, of course, the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion technology as a trend. So with that, thank you all very much, everyone. Have yourself a lovely Wednesday and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.